Thank everybody for being here with us tonight and taking time out of their schedule to listen and to maybe learn a little bit about what's happening and helping us to share and to gather stories. Um, Thank you to Simpatico Theater and Troy Foundry Theater for doing this for Charlie and I. We appreciate it more than you know. And thank you for Chris for being with us tonight to be able to share some insight. Our speaker tonight is Christopher Moraff. He spent over a decade reporting on the intersection of policing, criminal justice, and civil liberties. His immense reporting from Kensington, Philadelphia has earned him a reputation as an expert on injection drug culture and the fentanyl crisis. His work has appeared in publications including The Daily Beast, The Washington Post, and Al Jazeera America. He's co-host of the podcast Narcotica and curator of the stock photo site stashhouse.org. Chris also has his newest project, which is Narcomedia, which is his first kind of stab into video journalism, covering as a white man, covering communities of color and marginalized communities in Philadelphia. And he is trying to usher in a new era of reform of journalism ethics for journalists that are coming up. So please welcome me in bringing on our first speaker of this series at Simpatico Theater and Troy Foundry Theater, Christopher Moraff. Chris, thank you so much for being with us, man.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Adam. Can you hear me okay? Sounds good. Yeah. Okay. I'd like to start by saying that death is not a necessary end to opioid use. In fact, with safe supply, it doesn't need to even be terribly harmful. It has very little organ toxicity. Alcohol does far more damage. We could stop deaths by opioid overdose tomorrow if we really had the political will. That's the first thing I'd like to point out. And I've seen and experienced quite a few over my time first in the streets myself, and then on the other side covering this crisis. I like to call it the overdose crisis because it's not an opioid crisis. I wouldn't have a problem with people using opioids. I have a problem with people dying unnecessarily from them. And that was due to the imposition of fentanyl, illicit fentanyl, into the heroin supply as pill mills were cracked down on. And we can get in, that's a long story that is for another time. But I'd also like to dispel another myth, and that is that this only became a focus of media attention when white middle-class folks started dying. And I'd like to go back to 1991, when I was just a young 20-year-old or so, and I witnessed my first funeral from an overdose. And that was a 19-year-old white girl from a privileged family. And she was part of a group from Central High School, which is, if you're from Philadelphia, you know, is a very competitive high school to get into. It was a group of bright people. And she died, and nobody knew what to do. 911 was called. It was too late. There was no Narcan back then. There was really nothing but cold water and ice, and she was already blue by the time they found her in the morning. Half the people left. My best friend at the time, who was her boyfriend, stayed and saw that through. We then went to her funeral a few days later, at which two of her friends presented Landslide by Fleetwood Mac. They played, it was a duet. After which we proceeded to go cop heroin and get high. That is what the cycle of addiction is about. It's in many cases, a descending staircase into hopelessness that is magnified by the culture that we impose upon drug use, the policies that we impose upon drug users, and the stigma that we impose upon them, which leads to self-stigmatization. So a little bit about me. I began my career in journalism after becoming a failed rock star and then a failed short story writer. But I did have a talent for writing, and I started stringing for the Philadelphia Tribune, which is America's oldest, longest operating African American newspaper. It was a running joke that I was the token white guy at the Tribune. So I was instructed to go out into Black Philadelphia, bring back stories that mattered. And what did I know about that, right? But I did that, and I went out and I talked to people, and I gained their trust. And once I started telling enough stories, I realized that 80% of them at some point looped around to the war on drugs. They were either directly related to it, or they were related to voter disenfranchisement because of felony convictions, or economic depravity, the lack of opportunity and economic crime that leads to more crime. So there's studies that show that juvenile delinquency that's economically based is much more likely to lead to future adult arrests, because it becomes a job. It's a job for people that lack opportunity. I was with the Tribune for about 10 years off and on, and I wrote a lot of stories for them. That's when I began writing for Al Jazeera America and later the Daily Beast. And I think the first thing that popped on my radar was the chronic pain issue, that people that were in dire need of opioids were being systematically and abruptly cut off from them with no ancillary services at all. In fact, as recently as last year, I was having coffee with a source from the DEA, and they're going after doctors a bit harder now that the state attorney general has taken over the fight in Kensington here for the drug war here. And I said to him, what do you do for the people that come to the doctor that may be legitimate patients the next day and the doors are locked? And he acknowledged they could do better. He said, we let the emergency rooms know that they might get some overflow. I mean, that is a pathway into illicit drug use for people that were stabilized on a medication that is FDA approved, that is dose invariable, which means you're getting the same dose every time you know what you're taking. So our policies have contributed in many ways to the problems that we saw over the past, since 2014, I'd say, when we saw a spike in this enormous spike in overdose fatalities from fentanyl. And we've been late to the party ever since in catching up to addressing it. Fentanyl test strips I began using to sort of demonstrate for drug users on the street what they were taking. And by the time the city got around to introducing them, which I do give them credit for doing, because it was an investment that not everyone bought into, drug users were seeking out fentanyl. Fentanyl is now the drug of choice. It was a supply side imposition. It was not a demand side imposition, but it has become the drug of choice among former heroin users. When I stopped using heroin in 2003, fentanyl had yet to make its first appearance. Maybe there were sporadic cases here and there, but it was in 2006 when we first had our big outbreak from Chicago over to the East Coast. It was traced to the first super lab in Mexico. And I call that basically the test run. I mean, that was when Mexico started becoming a player, and it became evident that synthetic heroin was going to be a big moneymaker. The crackdown on pill mills, the first fentanyl deaths in the United States were from counterfeit pills. that just aggravated it and contributed to it. But I'm not just a journalist. I consider myself an ethnographer, a friend, a human being, someone that can walk into a community and understand what people are enduring. I also always stress to point out that the community that I cover is not representative of most drug users. I cover a population that is transient, homeless, often mentally ill, and most drug users are not that. The drug users, are the person in the cube next to you, like I was, and as a managing editor at a magazine, traveling to conferences 6 times a year with bundles in my pocket. They are your neighbor. They are your family members. And the good news is we've been given an unprecedented opportunity over the past 10 years to change the dynamic. When I got myself together, and sort of like, and to be fair, I'm not abstinence based. I do still dabble in other things. I don't believe in it. Well, I shouldn't say I don't believe. I've talked to doctors that are much smarter than me that tell me there is no such thing as an addictive personality. We each struggle with specific drugs. Some people struggle with more than one. My drug of choice was always opioids, and I know that is not a place I can go, and I wouldn't even have a desire to these days because it's not the same product as it used to be. It's I've seen what it does. The tranquilizer in the dope in Philly is as problematic, if not more, than the fentanyl. But we have an unprecedented opportunity. Medication assisted treatment was not talked about in 2003 when I finally got on a methadone clinic and began the process of getting myself off of heroin. And I was in and out of rehab, abstinence based, and they just kept telling me to keep coming back because if I worked it, hard enough, I'd get it. And eventually it dawned on me that if your cancer doctor told you that, they'd be fired. So we've seen medication assisted treatment become frontline, accepted, not as stigmatized at all as it used to be. There's still self-stigmatization among drug users, who want to be completely opioid free, and they don't really understand the dynamics of long-acting opioids like methadone or Suboxone and the short-acting ones. Naloxone is now available everywhere. You can now. I shouldn't speak. I can't speak for parts of the country that may be rural or isolated, but in Philadelphia, just about everybody carries Narcan with them. I carry it with me all the time. By the grace of God, I've only had to do one reversal, and it was the scariest thing that I think I ever experienced. This man was turning blue in front of me, and there was just me and one other person in a hit lot with him. And the eerie thing that I always remember, and I always like to retell, is that he was a construction worker. It was clear he was coming from work. It was that time of the night. He had his belt on, and as I'm trying to bring him back, and his lips are turning purple, his phone was ringing, and then it would hang up, and then it would ring again. Somebody was trying to get in touch with him. Maybe it was his wife. Maybe it was his kid. Somebody was wondering where he was, and I'll never forget that feeling of having this man's life, it seemed, in my hands, and knowing that somebody cared about him, and when I did finally revive him, he spoke very little English, but he tried to hand me $5, as a token of his appreciation, which of course I refused. But it just struck me, to the core that he wanted to pay me for saving his life, and that brings me to my work as a journalist. I am lucky enough, at least I have been lucky enough, I'm working on it for this year in 2021 to be grant funded, which gives me the freedom to straddle different worlds and sort of like bend what I believe to be anachronistic journalistic ethics. I won't name the network, but there's a national news network that came to Philadelphia when the bridge encampments were at the height of their population, which was 4 bridge encampments with maybe 400 people living under them during one of the coldest winters on record. And they called me to see if I would fix for them a little bit. And I didn't want a fee. I just wanted to be able to be on national news, like kind of telling you what I'm telling you now. And that didn't happen, but they made sure that they got their requisite pictures or requisite videos of the guy in a tent shooting up that I got them in. And it was just the basic story that we hear over and over again that barely scratches the surface of what this is about. And I decided then and there and when I told him that I would, it would probably be a good idea for him to get a carton of Newports, to hand out and, be good, as a gesture of good faith. He said, well, I'll run it by legal, but I'm not sure about that. He did bring the Newports, it turns out, but I realized that we're taking from a community, and we're not giving back in many cases, journalistic as journalists and reporters. And the community notices that, and it took me a year at least to gain enough trust to be, among people, and they knew me, they would come to know me by name. And really it was because I carried Narcan and Clean Works and I never carried cash because I have so much compassion that if I see somebody sick, I'll get them well. And I just had a newborn infant, and I certainly can't afford to do that anymore. So, but where I could, I would help, and they started letting me into their lives more and more, deeper and deeper, and I think that journalism can do better. That the field can do better at immersion reporting. Like, this is a war on domestic soil, and yet many journalists rely on proxies, like, on one hand law enforcement and government, on the other hand academics or harm reductionists or reformists, to tell the story for them, and they have the opportunity to go out in the field on the front lines themselves, and unfortunately the resources just aren't there. So I'm not a wealthy man. I'm now raising a baby, and and have a partner to take care of, and I do this because it's the only thing I know how to do, really. Writing about people that have been trampled in one way or another by our system that we have to take responsibility for at the end of the day. The war on drugs is a war on communities. It's a war on people. It's even a war on police. You know how many police are killed in the line of duty to prevent a consensual exchange of goods and services between 2 consenting adults? That is unacceptable, and I push police on that all the time. Why isn't this a workplace issue? Why isn't this a labor issue? And I find many beat cops at the that are actually out there walking the beat have more progressive views than you might think about this, although they won't publicly state that they talk to me. And that's been a point of pride for me, is to be able to talk to drug dealers and police and have them both know that what they tell me is privileged. I have more unpublished information than I have published, but it's about relationships, I guess I would close by just sort of once again reiterating that that we're at an unprecedented crossroads. We're talking about supervised injection in America, and that got upended a little bit by the way it was presented. And if you know anything about the story in Philadelphia, you know this. If you don't, I would encourage you to read about it, because I've written quite a bit about it for Filter magazine. But the fact that we're even talking about that is worlds away from where I was when we used to have to reuse a syringe until the numbers wore off of it and sharpen it on a matchbook. You know, and Prevention Point and the syringe exchanges have been great, and the Narcan has been game changing. I've seen more people reverse each other, and it always happens before the ambulance and the police get there. They show up, but the job's been done, and that is why the population that I cover is, because they're transient, they're always they cluster together, and you know, there's sort of like it's a double-edged sword. There's people that go home and that have the luxury of using alone, and they're often the ones that die. And I tell mothers all the time, you know, I get it. You know, you can't let your kid have a key to your house or whatever the case may be. They're going to rob you from you or steal stuff, but let them in for 20 minutes. Let them use the bathroom. You might save their life, you know, and then tell them they can go until the next time they need it. But I guess that's probably about all I have. I mean, I could talk a little bit about Narcomedia, which began as when I started getting invited by journalism schools to come speak to journalism students about what I do, and you know, and I guess my star kind of started rising a little bit on social media. And Jeff Jarvis at City University of New York was the first one to do so, and I've always admired him. And since then, I've received invitations from public health departments, the American Academy of Forensic Sciences had me come and speak at their annual convention about synthetic drugs, and particularly like synthetic cannabinoids, which have really wreaked havoc in Philadelphia, and even a law enforcement agency that wanted to know more about what they might be missing. And there is reform out there, and it doesn't look like it because this war has gone on for so long that we still look at it as, you know, the end goal is to get people to stop using drugs, and that's never going to happen. It's just not. In the meantime, we can keep them alive, though. We truly can. No one has to die of an opioid overdose. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer this.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. Your story's amazing. I'm so honored we got you on this conversation. We do have, if anybody wants to put a question into the chat, please do. You can also put in the chat if you'd like to ask your question live. Let me know. I can do that, and I can unmute you. I think I have that power. We do have one question. So question here, how has COVID affected the drug stream from Mexico into the United States? How has that affected Philadelphia?
That's a good question. So at first, the quality of the drug, of the heroin, the street heroin, declined precipitously. But I spoke to intelligence officials along the Mexican border, and I have some sources down there that said just as much was making it across. You know, I think that there was a perception that there was going to be a drought. Many of the precursor chemicals were already on the high seas, according to intelligence reports, when COVID hit China. But what it has done is the stay-at-home order decimated, you know, the population for a while. These are people that rely on, like, folks like you and me that are going to work or whatever, or like, you know, for their daily hustle to get well. And there was desperation, real desperation. I mean, it was like people were just getting hit for no reason. Just anger was, you know, like frustration was turning into anger, was turning into, you know, and I've noticed this before in the past, that when you disrupt drug markets. In the past, it was like Operation Sunrise in 1998 was an effort to like put a cop on every corner and make it just really difficult and scary to get drugs, you know. And it just became it just was a dog eat dog, you know, effect where one drug user would wait at the train for another one to come back and then rob him, because why go take the risk yourself? So when you know, the more pressure we put on black markets like that, the more unstable and chaotic they become. So yeah, the product declined. We've seen a really stark increase in the use of xylazine as a cutting agent. For a while, I had access to a lab that was doing mass spec work for us, and I think we were the only project, certainly in Philadelphia, and I believe on the East Coast, that was randomly sampling, like in real time, drugs that we acquired from the streets, and the xylazine, in many cases, was the dominant compound. And for those who aren't familiar with that, it's a export of Puerto Rico as a drug of abuse, largely. So it's always been sort of around and used as a cutting agent. It's a sedative for large animals, and it's if you go to Kensington and you see people just like completely zombified and out, is generally the xylazine that's in the heroin or the fentanyl they're using, or synthetic cannabinoids.
That actually kind of ties into another question that we just received, which is, I've heard that quality has dropped. Did this increase violence in Philadelphia?
Right. I mean, it's kind of yeah. I mean, in some ways, okay. So quality has dropped, but it's always been a hit or miss game. I mean, you can get a bag that was, you know, fire in the morning, and then in the afternoon it's just falling down to the garbage. But it did increase violence in the sense that like crews were fighting each other for the little bit of customers there were. So if you were, I heard stories of, like, you know, a guy who regularly copped at a certain corner, passing by that corner because their work had fallen off, and getting like beaten up basically for doing so, you know. But then what happened was the pandemic on insurance employment money hit, and suddenly there were people that had nothing at all walking around with, you know, $11, $12, $13,000, you know, and that turned the tables. I mean, there were, you know, corners that were only selling bundles for a while. You know, it was a free for all. You know, the community was deprived of everything, you know, they had, and then we just dumped money back into the economy, the drug economy. But I would say that yeah, it's generally like, you know, people go and cop now, you know, 2 or 3 different stamps to make sure that something is good, you know, where it used to be a level of consistency, and that's a function of what I call the freelancer effect, which is like, you know, when we take down like established organizations that are hierarchical and multi-generational, which mostly Latino drug crews were in West Kensington in the 90s. Now we have freelancers that are coming in from West Philly on the bus. They actually commute and just don't really know what they're doing. They don't have a lot of oversight. They don't have rules. You know, so there's been, you know, a lot of experimentation. Well, if you know anything about Philadelphia, we had an outbreak of synthetic cannabinoids, 5-FADB, which is a very powerful full agonist cannabinoid that was in the dope. And we know that they put it there intentionally because after everybody fell out, and this is an interesting commentary on harm reduction I'll bring up, they started dialing it back. And, you know, I started getting reports of like, yeah, I still feel it, but it's a lot less than it used to be. So they, you know, like they were experimenting with ways of enhancing the high. But what the lesson is for harm reductionists is that naloxone is not, it's very important to know whether somebody is having an overdose or an adverse effect of something else. And in that case, everybody was Narcan. And so whatever opioids were in their system were taken out, and all that was left was this synthetic cannabinoid that was like putting them on a mind fuck, you know, a trip. And so what may have been keeping them stable in some way, because it would reduce the levels of anxiety and paranoia. Was suddenly ripped from them, and that's why we heard reports of aggressive behavior and things that just generally don't accompany most of the reversals I've seen. I'd also like to point out that there have been and are today supervised injection type organizations and facilities and even drug dealers that carry Narcan with them. I know a meth dealer in South Philadelphia that travels. It's different than Kensington. They go from house to house, hit houses, and he's brought back like 40 people, because he always has it with him. So getting it out into the hands of everybody is really the best thing we can do.
Awesome. That leads into another question that we just got, which I think would be great. And we can share a bunch of links on our website for resources. But the question is, what are the best resources in Philadelphia to check out if you want to help the community?
Well, obviously, Prevention Point Philadelphia is great. But the people that are really doing the some of the hardest work and some of the most impactful work are doing it on their own. Adam knows Paul Gorman. He's mentioned Paul as somebody that might do it, might be on here. I admire Paul greatly. He's a one-man harm reduction show. Project Safe is a great group that works with sex workers that really have it probably the hardest up there. In South Philadelphia, it's a little bit less. There's can't think of her name. There's one person that's down there once a week distributing needles in the naloxone. But what a lot of people don't know is that you can buy needles in the drugstore here for like $2 for a 10-pack. It's not hard to get clean syringes, and that's been one of the biggest changes I've seen, and it's a good change. Is that people do not reuse syringes like anymore. They're using, they have the ability and the capacity and the desire to use a clean set of works every time they shoot up almost, and that was unheard of years ago. But it's limited to Philadelphia. We need reform. We need a state bill that will legalize syringe exchange across Pennsylvania and in other places where it's where it's illegal.
Yeah, absolutely. We have another question. What advice would you give to people trying to stop resorting to unhealthy coping methods? So, however you would interpret that. Yeah.
I have some unhealthy coping methods myself.
Yeah,
well, that's a very broad question. I would say that communicating with somebody that you're close with, and if you have 2 friends in your life, 3 friends, you're a rich man. I truly do believe that. You need somebody that you can be sincere and honest with. And unfortunately, we've created an environment where we've destroyed the doctor-patient relationship. We've destroyed the relationship even within the recovery community. Paul Yaber was a force in the city. He was a harm reductionist, and he died alone and under a trestle down by the tracks because he couldn't tell anybody that he had relapsed, or he'd get kicked out of his recovery house. He'd lose his housing. So housing is a big issue. So it's really more what can we tell the people around the people that need new coping skills. We need to recognize that the stigma that has been placed on drug users internalize themselves, and having somebody to speak to and not sort of just offer advice, and there also needs to be like a real trend of changing the laws around methadone. Like this is for heroin users and particularly or whatever, but this is a drug that's life-saving. It's way more it has way more potential to stabilize fentanyl users than Suboxone does. And unfortunately, it's still the subject of anachronistic rules and laws that allow individual clinics to make their own rules that are far more stringent than federal guidelines.
Yeah.
But coping is tough. I cope with anxiety. I take anti-anxiety meds for that, and I feel no shame in saying that. I mean,
Yeah.
in some cases, medication and that's why I believe in safe supply. Ultimately, you can build a supervised injection facility, but you're still the supply you're receiving is still nobody knows what it is. We would come back with samples that had 20 different compounds in it.
Yeah. So we have another experience and question to share here. I happened to be driving up Broad Street the day a group of Safe House protesters were marching south. There was a lot of hate, outrage, passion, some people who had lost family members themselves, who were vehemently opposed to harm reduction policies of any kind. How do we change minds on this issue? Can we get Safe House back?
Well, like I said, the good news is that wherever there's naloxone, there's a Safe House, right? But Safe House is still, I'm still in touch with them, and we're completing a documentary, me and my co-producer Seth Dalton, on this fight. Safe House may have been their role may have been to pave the way for somebody else to do this, and if that was their role, because they had the power and the political influence to take this to court and get a federal get a federal ruling on it, I'd say that they would all see that as a victory. But unfortunately, we're in a very divisive society right now, and the same people that we're fighting against Safe House we're fighting against wearing masks, and it's like it's the same group, and the Columbus statue in South Philadelphia, it's the same group. And I would say that so during the filming of the documentary we're working on, we went home with a drug user who himself was against having it in South Philadelphia. He felt that it was too close to home, and that he should, it shouldn't be in a place where there's daycares and other elderly care, and he wanted it to be in Kensington. And we sat down with his mom and showed her, and she had been opposed, and we showed her a picture of what Insight looked like, and she said, oh my God, like I had no idea that's what it was. Like, I just pictured this big living room with a bunch of pillows where people were getting high. And so information is the best, is the best course of action. But I would say that at the end of the day, I don't believe that community buy-in is necessary. This is a life-saving measure. Nobody asked me if I wanted Wendy's on the corner of Broad and Snyder. I don't see why that's necessary now. And I think that it wouldn't be sharing too much to say that I think Safe House got that lesson in South Philadelphia.
Yeah, absolutely. Another great question popped up here. Where can people get Narcan in Philadelphia?
Well, they can get it at Prevention Point, certainly. They can get it from Paul Gorman, and I don't have his number handy. They can get it from me. But if you if you need to get it in big increments, you go to the Department of Health, because or reach out to the if you can, and I have some contacts there, because they have cases of stuff that's like a little bit over expiration, and they can't do anything with it anymore, but they can give it to me, and the jury is still kind of out on how long that lasts, and but it's pretty clear that a year over the expiration date is still going to save a life.
Awesome. And we're gonna I'm making note of all these resources. We're gonna build up our resource page on our website and make sure that we'll share that with all our folks too, and see how we can get that out there. There was another question here. Let me scroll back up to it. Great. So we have someone who has shared with us, I'm also a recovering addict, journalist, and harm reductionist. do you ever find yourself experiencing cravings? I know there are times I've struggled doing the work I do.
Um, Strangely enough, no, and that's because, well, for one thing, it's been a long time, and I I you know I think that my life has changed quite a bit since then. You know, I'm almost 50 now. I have a child. My anxiety is taken care of, and through other medication, and but mostly it's because I've seen that it's not the same drug I was using. It doesn't look appealing to me. Uh, I got energy from opioids. I would go for 10-mile bike rides. I didn't want to be asleep, and after seeing what's in the dope, it's cheaper and it's more powerful, but it's packed with sedating like compounds and cutting agents that are just going to basically put you to sleep. And that was not something that I desired from an opioid high.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Thank you.
But I would say that everybody, you need to be aware of your own limitations, and certainly time um and sort of time is a big factor. I couldn't have gone back out there 2 or 3 years after I got my act together, but it was, I'd say, I started working on criminal justice reform work, and prisoner reform and stuff like that. And it wasn't until, I guess, 2017 when I was asked to do some fixing for a production company that wanted to consider shooting a documentary at Campamento, which was the closest thing we've had to a real supervised consumption facility. It was just supervised by drug dealers, and that was unacceptable to the city. But it wasn't until about 2017 that I went full time back into Kensington, and it brought back a lot of memories. I mean, I remember walking in there my first time at maybe the age of 19 or 20, and just feeling like I had entered another world, and I feel a sense of I still feel a sense of kind of like home up there, like it's a strange dichotomy of like, it's desperation, but there's like there's also community and beautiful compassion that I see all the time.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to ask you to plug a few more things and tell us a few more things that you have coming up so we can link to those as well. But first, I just want to share, they're not questions, but we've gotten a couple comments that you're an inspiration. And then break up the encampments and it causes death. The encampments are safe injection sites, and some agreements.
It's true.
Yeah,
that's true. And that's been, the irony of having a progressive DA is that is that police have found other ways than arrest to disrupt the lives of drug users, and certainly, like, moving them around and keeping them constantly on the they'll fence off an area that was perfectly well, keeping like a dozen people, like just giving them some shelter and some like camaraderie, and using a loan is the most dangerous thing, and they'll just fence it off, and just move on, and so we may be arresting fewer people for using drugs. There's open drug use on the streets of Kensington now, though, where they've shut down all the abandoned buildings and they've filled in the lots, and so the drug war is still alive and well, even under the Krasner regime or whatever. But and there's still a lot of misinformation, around fentanyl, and there has been a learning curve for Larry Krasner as well. But I appreciate the comment. That's my goal, really, to just inspire. I was in a meeting once, and a guy came up to me and said, like, just following your Twitter feed made me come from. He was a suburban guy from somewhere in the white communities of and he came down to Kensington and just started walking around and looking for a way he can help, and he got himself tapped into an organization, and he had changed. He was now actively changing things, and that was better to me than, an award or Pulitzer Prize or whatever. Although a Pulitzer would be nice.
Yeah. So like, give us some plugs. Hit us with the Twitter handle and the ways that we can follow your amazing work. As someone just said to keep up the good work, brother. You are doing the right work. So how can we continue to follow your journey?
So I'd first say, unfortunately, my primary Twitter account got hacked, and I was shut out of it. So not everyone's a fan, but that's at CMaraf and it's still there. It's still active. It's still got my archive. You can look at it. Just if anybody direct messages you from there, it's not me. But it's got a lot of my testing. I mean, it's got so much of my intellectual property there that and I've been struggling to get it back. But Twitter is like an opaque wall of doom, But I'm at Maraf Reports now, so at Maraf Reports. I'm at Facebook. At my Facebook page is Maraf Journalism, Facebook.com/Maraf Journalism, and then Narcomedia is Facebook.com/Maraf Reports. So, but if you go to my primary Facebook page, you'll find, I think there's a link to Narcomedia, which will eventually be a YouTube channel, and
nice.
And I'm launching a new website, and I'd like to sort of like do more of this, what I'm doing right now.
You should be, absolutely. Well, we'll link to all of those things as well, and make sure that we help get that word out there, get your word out there.
Sure.
Thank you so much.